It was the kind of light you only get high on the ridge, pale and slanted, like it had been sifted through spruce needles. Down in a narrow crack of stone, that light caught on something the color of late summer violets. A backpack cleaner than it had any right to be wedged tight in the granite, the strap turned just enough to show a fray I recognized from an old photograph. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. On most October mornings back then, our town woke slow. The diner on River Road put out cinnamon rolls, big as a fist hunter's compared boot prints by the door, and the park breathed that cool 58-degree air that makes the lungs feel brand new. By noon, the leaf peepers filled the overlooks, and by evening you could hear the clack of porch swings along Baskin's Creek as folks settled in to listen for owls. That rhythm raised me, kept me honest, and carried me through 26 years in a ranger uniform. When I retired, I bought the old bait shop near the edge of town and turned it into Whitaker Outfitters maps on the wall, bear spray behind the counter, and a hand-painted sign offering coffee to anyone headed up toward Klingman's Dome. I knew the Brooks girl and the Ellison girl because our boys all scraped knees on the same ball fields, and I knew the Abbott girl because she'd stand in my doorway each spring with that notepad of hers writing down what I said like it might matter. Tiana liked to talk gear, how many miles you could put on a pair of boots before they turned on you, what a good pack felt like when you cinched it right. Jada smiled with her eyes first, then let the rest of her catch up. She'd take a pencil from the jar and draw the way sunlight falls through laurel leaves, patient as a clock. Kim wanted names for everything. She'd point to an old topo map and ask what a saddle really meant. I'd pull down a plastic model of the ridge and show her the low dip between two rises. She'd nod and note the contour lines like they could make the ground behave. The park sits like a sleeping animal between Tennessee and North Carolina, all hollows and folds and old stories. I'd walked most of it with Eli Harper, my partner in the days when winter came down mean, and the phone rang at 3 a.m. with somebody lost between a creek and a wrong turn. Eli's the kind of man who studies a boot heel and tells you whether a person limped that morning or just favored one side for habit. We used to roll our eyes at tourists who tried to measure the Smokies in feet or miles or hours. I told them the Smokies measured you right back by patience, by judgment, by whether you respected what water can do when it's given a steep run and a sudden storm. That fall, the college brochures on the counters looked like postcards from a bigger life. Tiana's mother, Nina, folded hers small and tucked them in a purse that never closed for long. She kept the school secretary desk straight as a pool table, but the instant a kid needed something, she had it like she'd known all along. Mark Ellison came by my shop on a Wednesday to borrow a stud finder I wasn't using. He left with it wrapped in a plastic grocery sack and a promise to bring back the sack and the tool before Monday. He was that kind of man, owl quiet, until there was a beam to set, or a boy to advise about a life that didn't require shouting. Faye Abbott wore scrubs most days, floral jacket and cold weather hair, clipped back like someone who values her minutes. She'd laugh outside my door after an overnight at the clinic, the sound soft and plain, and say, 2 miles today, Caleb. If I don't keep moving, I'll turn into the break room coffee machine. The girls 18, with the sky cracked open for them, were a regular sight that summer. They bought topo maps and a used compass. Tiana picked out a pack the color of a field of violets, which she called mood insurance. Jada tested trail pencils with quick light strokes, then tucked a spiral sketchbook into a side pocket that fit like it had been sewn for it. Kim asked me to mark 3 day loops under 8 miles, no creek crossings if rain was in the forecast. She made a list, then a second list for what might go wrong. I smiled at that, not because I thought it would, but because caution is one of the few gifts you can hand a mountain and expect to get back. I remember the Friday before everything turned. Morning fog sat low no more than 20 feet off the grass in town, and by midday it burned off to a blue that made the ridge look carved from glass. I tuned a radio behind the counter to the local station, the one that plays old country in the mornings and high school football on Fridays. A couple from Ohio came in asking about a waterfall they'd seen in a brochure. I sketched them a loop that wouldn't leave them hiking by headlamp. Around 2, Jada walked in carrying a brown paper bag with 3 sandwiches and a note pinned to the side, Nina's handwriting stout and tidy. Don't forget water. Be smart. Call it the trailhead. I asked if they had layers. Tiana thumped the purple pack and said, 60 degrees at home doesn't mean 60 at 6,000 feet. She'd listened over the years. I loved her for that. Nothing felt off, not then. The wind was nosing the tops of the poplars, but not enough to raise a flag. The temperature at the dome had run cool all week, mid-50s by afternoon, and the forecast called for a clear evening with a thin crescent moon. I watched the 3 of them step off the curb and cross toward Nina's car, keyed to their easy rhythm, the way one reached for the handle and the other traded places without talking because somebody's knee does better on the aisle. It was the casual choreography of friendship, and if you'd asked me to pin the whole world's safety on anything at that moment, I would have chosen that small kindness. In towns like ours, time stretches in both directions. The church bells measure it simple. The school buses give it shape. The park, when it's behaving, gives it a kind of mercy. People pay attention to porch lights. They notice when the mail comes out at 1 and goes back in at 1:10. They care in a way that isn't noisy. You learn to read a street by smell and sound the muffler of a truck that's been a quart low since May, the hot sugar from the kettle corn stall that pops up when tourists crowd the strip, the brief hush that falls when deer step out of the tree line behind the baseball field. Late afternoon that day, I stood in my doorway and breathed the spruce and leaf rot and wood smoke that mean home. The park breathed back. Eli stopped by near closing brim of his hat, pulled low so he could see the glass case without reflection. He wanted a replacement filter for a water pump. We talked about the trail work up near the Alum Cave Bluff and whether the new tie steps would hold after the first hard freeze. He mentioned a hiker who'd wandered off trail earlier in the week and found himself cliffed out above a 5-foot drop that might as well have been 50. No injuries, just a bruise on pride and a lesson earned cheap. We were both grateful for those lessons, the ones that end in a handshake instead of a report. The girls by then were somewhere under that big sky. If you stood at the concrete platform near the observation tower and looked west, the ridges rose and fell like a sleeping thing breathing. At that elevation, sound doesn't carry the way it does down by the river. A laugh can vanish 2 feet from your ear if the wind takes it. The spruce up there grip the ground with shallow roots and still hold their ground, which is a sermon in its own right. I knew what the trail felt like in the late hours when the sun exits fast behind the crest and the temperature can slide 10 degrees in 15 minutes. None of that worried me, not with 3 smart girls and an early start and a town full of folks who take care of their own. Just before dusk, a bistable hour, when the lights along the parkway flip on and the storefronts glow like warm fish tanks, I locked the shop and walked the 1 mile home. You learn your neighbors' schedules without trying. Nina's porch light comes on at 6 all year. Mark's dog barks once at every passing jogger, then goes back to licking his paws. Faye waters her geraniums whether they need it or not, because action is a comfort. My wife was setting a roast on the counter to rest, and we ate with the windows cracked open, the air in the 50s, and clean. After supper, I stepped onto our porch with a mug of black coffee and watched a thin line of cars roll by toward the cabin rentals. Somewhere out there, a pair of headlights turned up a gravel drive, and a man hauled luggage through a door that would stick until the second shove, same as last year. At 8, I took the trash to the curb. 2 raccoons tilted their masked heads and decided I wasn't worth the trouble. The radio inside moved from ball scores to the weather clear and cool, a low around 49-degree rave in town, a good 10 degrees colder at the high points. I hummed a song nobody born after 1975 knows and checked the chain on the side gate. Normal looks like nothing, and nothing is often what you hope for. What I remember most is the smallness of the first wrong detail. A missed call that wasn't missed so much as delayed a habit among parents when they're giving teenagers a little extra rope. a kind of trust flavored with caution. Then a text that usually gets a heart or a thumbs up didn't. Then a second porch light came on 2 doors down sooner than I'd expect for a Friday in October, when folks linger outside to breathe the air before winter stiffens it. I told myself it was nothing. People have their reasons. Cross-country runners get ice baths. Nurses work double shifts. Contractors bid jobs before the competition does. The mountain holds them all. By 9, I could hear the creek louder than usual. That happens when there's less traffic and your ear decides to pick a different channel. A neighbor closed a screen door soft enough that it probably wouldn't have woken a cat. On our street, quiet is comfort, not a warning. I walked the block like I do most nights past mailboxes that lean the same way the trees do when the big winds push through in March. Nina's porch light was still on, washing the front steps a gentle gold. Mark's work truck idled twice and then settled. Faye's living room lamp made a yellow square on her curtains, a nurse's light on until the person inside decides it's safe to turn it off. If you'd asked me what the Smokies were saying right then, I would have told you they were in a good mood. Dark, but not mean cool, but not cruel, the kind of night that makes sleep come easy. I stood there under a sky chipped thin enough to show a dozen clean stars, and tried to remember if I'd promised to oil the front gate on Saturday or the next Saturday. I let the coffee go cold in my hand. A sedan drifted past headlights low. A family late to a rental with a picket fence and a hot tub that would steam like a witch's pot come morning. The road took them without complaint, and the quiet settled back into place. Some nights end on their own. This one waited. The porch light across from ours didn't dim. The lamplight 2 doors down held steady. I watched the hour slip from 9:30 to 10, then a little past, and listened to the creek move steady as a clock. Somewhere way up on the ridge, a breeze combed the firs. I set my empty mug on the rail and stayed a while longer, eyes on a pair of driveways that should have filled with familiar headlights. They didn't. Not yet. And the lights stayed on. The night stretched long and patient, the kind that swallows sound until you start to wonder if the world's gone still on purpose. The porch lights across the street glowed too long, and that's when a feeling I'd buried from my ranger days started creeping back, the one that sits behind your ribs when a hiker's overdue, and the math no longer makes sense. Around 10:30, Nina Brooks called the house. My wife picked up, but I could hear her voice through the receiver. Before she even handed it to me, thin tight caught between trying not to sound worried and already knowing she should be. She said the girls hadn't checked in. No call, no text. She'd driven by Jada's place, but Mark hadn't heard anything either. They were supposed to have been off the trail by 6. I told her not to panic, that service up near the dome was fickle even on a good day, and there were plenty of reasons for a late return. But the truth was, the Smokies go dark fast. Once you lose that last light over the ridge, you're hiking blind under a ceiling of mist. I knew it, and so did she. By 11, I was in the truck heading up toward Klingman's Dome. The roads curve tight there, steep switchbacks where the headlights catch fog and turn it into smoke. The park gate was open for a night maintenance crew, and the ranger on duty recognized my old badge number even though I hadn't worn it in years. He waved me through and said they'd already had 2 calls from worried parents. Said he was trying to reach Eli, who was technically off shift but always answered when things like this came through. I parked at the main lot just below the tower, and the cold hit me square. Up there you can taste the weather-wet spruce stone dust, that metallic bite of air dropping toward the 40s. The first thing I noticed was how empty it sounded. The wind pushes through the firs in long breaths, and sometimes you can hear small animals rustling the duff, but that night it was as if the forest had turned its face away. I walked the first half-mile of trail with a flashlight and called their names. Nothing but my own echo. When Eli arrived a little past midnight, he brought 2 more rangers, and together we made a slow pass down the main loop. It's hard to explain what it feels like to search for someone in those woods. Every stick snap tricks you into hope. Every shadow looks like movement until it isn't. By 1 a.m., we'd covered the most likely routes, and there was no sign of them, Not a dropped bottle, not a piece of fabric, not a footprint clean enough to read. Down at the base of the trail, the families had gathered Nina, Mark, and Faye, their faces lit by the headlights of parked cars. They were calm in that hollow way people get when the worst hasn't been spoken out loud yet. I kept my voice level, told them we'd be expanding the search at dawn. Eli took down descriptions, clothing colors, gear, brands, even the type of shoes. Nina's hands shook when she mentioned the purple backpack, said it was easy to spot from a distance. That detail stuck with me, the color against all that green and brown. When I told Eli, he wrote it in his notebook, circled it once, then underlined it twice. By sunrise the next morning, the search was official. Park rangers, volunteers, and 2 rescue dogs fanned out from the trailhead. The dogs picked up faint traces near a footbridge less than a mile in, but the scent broke apart on the wind before it led anywhere. The terrain up there is deceptive smooth in places, then suddenly falling away into ravines that don't show on casual maps. The fog rolled through in sheets thick enough that you could lose sight of a man standing 10 feet away. I saw mothers calling their daughters' names into the mist, their voices swallowed whole. Every hour that passed without a sign felt like another mile between us and the girls. The second day brought more people. Local news vans parked at the Overlook Volunteers with makeshift radios lined the pullouts, and a field base formed at the visitor center. I moved between teams, helping plot grid routes and mark where streams had flooded recently. Around midday, one group reported a water bottle lodged in a drift of leaves by a creek bed, but it turned out to belong to another hiker who'd passed through earlier in the week. Hope flared and died so often that it started to feel mechanical. Someone would shout. People would run, and then it would quiet down again. By the third morning, even the dogs looked exhausted. I remember standing near a cluster of rhododendrons, the sun barely warming the ground, when Eli walked over and said, "We're running out of trail." His eyes were bloodshot from 2 nights of no sleep. He kept rubbing the brim of his hat like he could smooth the worry out of it. He said we'd keep pushing the perimeter until sundown, then reassess. That was the first time I realized he was already preparing for the search to shift from rescue to recovery, even if he couldn't say it yet. The families stayed close to the command tent, taking turns talking to anyone who'd listen. Faye passed out bottled water to volunteers like she needed to keep her hands moving. Mark hardly spoke. He just kept staring at the map board, tracing the colored lines that marked each day's sweep. Nina prayed quietly beside a folding table where the sign-in sheets were kept. Every so often she'd look toward the ridgeline, like she could see through it if she tried hard enough. I'd seen grief before, but this was something slower, like the light draining from a long exposure photograph. Rain hit on the 4th night. Not a hard storm, but steady enough to turn the soil slick and fill the low gullies with runoff. It's the kind of rain that erases tracks and muddles scent trails. By morning, the footprints we'd flagged were gone. The dogs whined at the edges of clearings and sat down noses wet. I overheard a young ranger curse under his breath, and Eli told him to hush, not out of anger, just to keep the air from breaking. We kept moving. You can't stop when people are missing. You just narrow the circle until the mountain either gives them back or swallows them whole. A week passed. The helicopters pulled out first. Fuel budgets don't stretch forever, and the weather up high had started to shift toward early winter. The volunteer numbers thinned next. Then the press lost interest. What remained were the families, a few rangers and locals who couldn't stand the thought of those girls being left out there alone. We found small things, a scrap of blue nylon, an empty granola wrapper, but nothing that could be tied to them for certain. Every piece of debris turned into a question we couldn't answer. By the end of that month, the official search wound down. The paperwork called it a suspended operation pending new evidence. I'd seen that phrase before. It's a bureaucrat's way of saying the forest won. I remember sitting with Eli at the ranger station, our coffee gone cold, while he filled out the last of the forms. He kept staring at the line where he had to write status unresolved. He wrote it slow, like the letters themselves weighed something. Outside, the ridge was dark, and the fog hung low over the valley. I could still hear Nina's voice from earlier that evening asking if there was any chance, any at all, that the girls had just gotten turned around, found shelter somewhere. I didn't have the heart to tell her that by then the nights were too cold for that kind of hope. As winter set in, the story faded from headlines, but not from town. You'd see the flyers on telephone poles, months later, edges curled and rain-streaked the ink of 3 smiling faces beginning to bleed. Some nights I'd drive the park road out of habit and stop at the overlook just to stand there. The wind would come down sharp through the pines, and I'd think about that purple backpack Nina described, the straps bright against the moss, how it might still be out there somewhere under the canopy waiting. The mountain doesn't forget. It just keeps its secrets until it's ready to talk. The following spring, the families held a vigil at the trailhead. Candles lined the stone wall, and the air smelled faintly of rain and wax. A minister read a prayer about endurance, about how sometimes closure isn't something you find, but something you learn to carry. I stood near the back hands in my jacket pockets, listening to the wind slide through the trees. A little girl from town, couldn't have been more than 6, set down a handful of wildflowers near the base of the sign. She didn't know them, but she looked up at the faces on the poster and whispered something only the mountain heard. Life moved because it has to. The trails reopened fully that summer, tourists came back, and my shop filled again with hikers asking about waterfalls and bears. Still, every time someone mentioned Klingman's Dome, I felt that pinch behind my ribs. People assume the forest forgets, but it never does. It just waits for the right kind of disturbance, a storm, a flood, a rock slide, to stir the past loose. Years later, in early August of 2008, that's exactly what happened. A late afternoon storm rolled over the Smokies, the kind that drops without warning, dumping inches of rain in under an hour. I was in town watching the gutters overflow when the radio crackled with a ranger frequency I hadn't heard in a while. Something about hikers in a restricted zone finding an item of interest near Raven's Hollow. The voice on the other end mentioned a color purple, and my heart sank before I even heard the rest. When I pulled into the ranger station that evening, Eli was there, older, slower, but still steady. He looked at me the way you look at someone who's about to hear something heavy. On the table between us lay a clear evidence bag, and inside it was a backpack, faded but intact. The straps tangled, one frayed corner I recognized. I could almost see the girls in my doorway again, laughing about layers and trail snacks full of the kind of confidence you wish the world would protect. The ranger who'd found it explained that 2 college students mapping erosion along a cliff face miles from any marked path had spotted the pack wedged in a crevice. They'd hauled it out with a rope expecting it to be empty. It wasn't. There were personal items inside, small things that only meant something if you'd been there at the start. I remember running my hand over the plastic bag and feeling the weight through the barrier. It wasn't much, but it was proof the mountain hadn't forgotten them after all. That night I drove home under a sky bruised from the storm, thinking how time bends in a place like this. 4 years of silence, and then a single object appears like a message from the deep. The mountain had spoken again, just enough to remind us that its stories don't end when we stop looking. I didn't know it yet, but that flash of purple against the stone was only the beginning of what the forest was about to give back and what it still meant to keep. The first time I saw the backpack outside the evidence bag, it didn't look like something that had spent 4 years in the wild. It was dusty, sure, but the color deep violet still caught the light like new fabric. The straps were intact, the seams solid, and even the metal zippers shined where you'd expect rust. It sat on the stainless table at the ranger station, out of place among mud-caked boots and raincoats hung to dry. Eli was the one to open it. He slipped on gloves and unfastened the clips with that slow care you use when something feels sacred. Inside were a few small things, a cracked compass, a map folded along worn creases, and a pencil nub tucked beside it. There were no personal notes, no phone, nothing with ink. just the smell of damp nylon and something faintly sweet like the forest had tried to keep it clean. Dr. Mara Klein, the forensic specialist, came down from Knoxville that same week. I'd met her years earlier during a flood case, sharp-minded, gentle tone, the kind who asked more than she told. She examined the pack and said almost to herself that it didn't look weathered enough. When I asked how long something like that could last out there, she said, "Not like this. Maybe a season if it was sheltered." That word sheltered hung in the air longer than it should have. By the weekend, the investigation had shifted focus. They started tracing the storm paths following the creeks and drainage lines that feed down from Klingman's Dome into a place few hikers visit, Ravens Hollow. It's a steep basin, half swallowed by cliffs where rain collects and vanishes underground. The search teams had never gone that far back in 2004. It was too unstable then, too dangerous. But the flash flood that spring had torn the land open, carving new channels. That's where the geologists had found the backpack wedged in a crack of granite nearly 60 feet up from the ground. Eli called in a smaller crew, Tessa Reed, a climber who'd trained our volunteer unit, Jamal Ortiz, a field medic, and a young backcountry ranger named Paige Sanders. I joined them mostly as an extra pair of eyes. Old habits die hard, and I couldn't stay home knowing that something belonging to those girls had surfaced again. We set out before dawn on a Tuesday, the air heavy with mist. The trail down into the hollow was rough roots, slick as glass stones loose underfoot. The forest felt older there, quieter, as if the noise of the modern world couldn't reach that far. We followed the flow of the creek until the land began to pinch inward, the banks steepening into narrow walls. Tessa went ahead, her rope scraping against the rock as she searched for stable footing. The rest of us followed in single file. You could feel the cold rising from the ground, the kind that seeps through boots and lingers in your bones. Around mid-afternoon, the sky thinned just enough for a stripe of sunlight to reach the water. That's when Paige noticed it a shadow behind a curtain of laurel. She brushed the branches aside, and the opening appeared narrow and uneven, like the earth had split just enough to show its teeth. The air inside that cave was still. Not quiet still. You could feel pressure in your ears like stepping underwater. The beam from my flashlight caught on jagged rock, then on something pale in the corner that I first mistook for stone. When I stepped closer, I saw it wasn't. It was bone. A partial skeleton slumped near the wall, one arm extended toward the entrance as if reaching for light. Beside it lay a small, damp book. Jada's name was scrawled inside the cover in pencil, faint but readable. The sketches inside leaves mountain ridges the outline of a stream, told their own story. Eli radioed for backup while I stayed near the entrance, taking in the small details that memory never lets go of: the glint of a rusted blade on the floor, a tangle of shoelaces, a hair clip that might have once been blue. The knife caught my attention. The handle was carved with a rough pattern, almost decorative, but not store-made. I'd seen one like it before. Years earlier, we'd cited a man named Darius Holt for illegal trapping near this same region. He was a loner kept to the hills, known for his handmade tools and his short fuse. He hadn't been seen in years. I told Eli about the knife, and he gave a slow nod. We both knew that in places like this, people disappear for different reasons, but they rarely disappear alone. The remains were recovered carefully, each piece wrapped and cataloged. Dr. Klein arrived 2 days later, confirming what our hearts already knew. The fracture in the skull, the position of the body, it looked like a fall, but not a clean one. Something or someone had made them seek shelter here. And still, 2 of the girls, Tiana and Kim, were unaccounted for. News of the discovery spread fast. The families came up to the ranger station, their faces drawn, their hope replaced by the kind of quiet that follows long years of waiting. Nina held Jada's sketchbook against her chest like it was a living thing. No one said much. There wasn't anything left to say. While the official teams processed the site, Eli asked me to help trace the creek farther downstream. We figured if the flood had moved the backpack, maybe it had shifted other things too. The path was choked with debris, fallen branches, scraps of tarp, twisted wire traps likely left behind by poachers. We marked each one, taking photos as we went. Late in the afternoon, when the light was beginning to fade, Jamal spotted something half buried in silt near a bend in the creek. It was a camera coated in mud, the lens cracked. I handed it to Eli, who wrapped it in a dry cloth like it might break apart if touched too roughly. Back at the lab, the memory card was still intact. The images, once recovered, played like fragments of a dream. The girls smiling on the trailhead, sunlight spilling through trees. A few shots of the ridge, then darker ones, blurred, grainy. In the last series, the lens tilted toward the woods, and behind them, at the edge of the frame, stood a shape that didn't belong. Tall, indistinct human. When the tech adjusted the contrast, the outline sharpened. A man, maybe 30 feet back, watching. The timestamp on that final image read 6:47 p.m., October 15th, 2004. The same evening, they vanished. That night, I sat in the ranger office long after everyone else had gone. The rain tapped the window, steady and thin. The screen showed that frozen image a shadow against the trees, and I kept thinking about how many times I'd walked those same woods, never knowing who else might have been watching from just out of sight. The next morning, Eli brought in the old case file on Holt. The notes were brief, illegal trapping, possession of unregistered firearms, one assault complaint that never made it to court. He'd grown up in the foothills, lived alone in a shack past the Tennessee border, and knew every back trail for 20 miles. No one had seen him since early 2005. Eli leaned back in his chair and said, "If he was out here when they were, he might have found them first." We searched the property records, found nothing. But a week later, a forestry officer checking a remote section of land came across a small structure half collapsed under fallen trees. Inside were old cans, a rope cot, and a notebook sealed in a tin box. The name on the inside cover matched D. Holt. The pages were damp, the handwriting shaky but legible. He wrote about finding 2 girls hurt after the storm, about being afraid to go for help because of his record, about promising he'd bring food, and then getting trapped himself when the cave mouth partially collapsed. The entries stopped in late November, a month after the girls disappeared. I drove up there myself to see the place. It was little more than a lean-to with walls of rough plank and canvas, the kind of shelter you build when you plan to stay hidden. The air inside smelled like rust and pine sap. There were tools scattered across a workbench, handmade snares, traps, a half-finished knife with the same carved handle pattern as the one from the cave. I remember stepping out into the clearing, the forest pressing in on all sides, and realizing how easily you could live out there without anyone knowing. Back at the station, Dr. Klein finished her report. The blood on the knife from the cave was a mixture animal and human. It confirmed that Holt had been there, but not what had happened after. The theory forming was simple and terrible. The girls had fallen or been caught by rising water. Holt had found them alive, and in trying or pretending to help, he'd trapped himself too. A storm, a collapse, panic. Maybe guilt later, maybe not. When we told the families, the room went quiet. Faye was the first to speak. "So he left them?" she asked. Eli nodded once, slow. Nina just stared at the table, her hands folded, her eyes not moving. There are moments when the truth doesn't comfort, it just clarifies the ache you already had. That was one of them. Over the next few weeks, we mapped the area again, searching for any secondary chambers or paths the flood might have sealed. The hollow had changed shape, the creek bed deeper, the ridges steeper. Nature doesn't care about evidence. It reclaims everything. Still, we kept looking. One morning, while clearing brush near where the creek met the base of the cliff, Paige's shovel struck something hollow. Under layers of rock and silt, we found what looked like the edge of a tunnel. We cleared just enough to see inside a small cavity, maybe 6 feet deep. The soil smelled of iron and decay. Within minutes, we knew. Two sets of remains lay side by side, bones interwoven, the remnants of fabric still clinging to them. On one wrist was a silver bracelet. Beside it, a folded map sealed in plastic. The air in that space turned heavy. No one spoke. Eli rested a hand on the rock and closed his eyes for a second before calling it in. We stepped back to let Dr. Klein's team take over. I walked a few yards away and sat on a fallen log, the creek whispering behind me. The sound was soft, almost kind. That evening, as the sun slid behind the ridge, the hollow filled with orange light. It touched the laurel leaves and the wet stones, and for a brief moment the place looked peaceful again. The girls had been found, all three. The mountain had given them back in pieces, but it had kept its promise. Still, there was one thing it hadn't returned: Darius Holt. His name was written in every report, every headline, but no one knew where he'd gone after that last journal entry. Some said he might have died out there, his body buried under another slide. Others thought he'd walked away too broken to face what he'd done. I didn't know which possibility unsettled me more. That night I left the ranger station long after dark. The parking lot was empty except for the reflection of the floodlights on wet pavement. I drove slow through the switchback's windows cracked, letting the cool air roll in. Down below, the valley shimmered with mist. Somewhere out there beyond the tree line lay an answer still buried, one we hadn't earned the right to find yet. The mountain had spoken once, maybe twice. I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't done. When you've worked in search and rescue long enough, you learn the land has its own memory. It keeps the pieces it wants and gives the rest back in its own time. After the girls were found, we thought maybe that was it, that the Smokies had spoken, and now it would go quiet again. But the mountain wasn't finished. 2 weeks after the recovery, I was back at the ranger station going through the final reports when Eli came in holding a small dented metal box wrapped in a zip bag. He said it had been found by a cleanup crew clearing a secondary ravine a few miles from the cave. Probably washed loose after the last rain, he said. Inside the box was a stack of letters bound with old twine, the paper yellowed and soft around the edges. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. It didn't take long to realize whose it was. Darius Holt had written every page. We read them in silence, one after another, until the air in the room felt heavier than before. The letters weren't addressed to anyone in particular, but you could tell they were meant for the families, or maybe for God, if he still believed anyone was listening. In the first ones, his words were scattered, almost frantic. He described finding 2 girls hurt, one trapped under rock, and how he'd stayed with them because he couldn't stand the idea of leaving them to die alone. He wrote about promising to come back with food, about trying to dig them out with his bare hands when the second storm hit. By the later pages, the writing slowed the lines steadier, resignation creeping in. The last letter ended mid-sentence, like he'd run out of strength before he could find the right words. Dr. Klein's team confirmed what we suspected: the paper fibers matched samples from the journal found in his cabin. Same ink, same hand. But what struck me most wasn't the confession itself, it was the tone. There wasn't much guilt, at least not in the way you'd expect. It read more like a man trying to explain his fear, as if he wanted history to know he hadn't meant harm, that he'd just been in over his head the way the girls had been. It was strange and human and hard to forgive. A few days later, Eli and I drove out to the ravine where the letters had surfaced. The trail was little more than a deer path, flanked by ferns taller than my waist. You could smell the soil before you saw the clearing, wet, rich, almost metallic. The overhang where the box had been found looked like a temporary shelter, a tarp nailed to 2 trees, half collapsed with the remains of a small fire pit in front. Inside, we found remnants of canned food, a broken lantern, and tucked beneath a flat rock, a photograph. It was creased and sun-faded, but when I brushed the dirt off, I recognized them immediately. Tiana Jada and Kim standing at the trailhead, arms slung around each other, smiling straight at the camera. I just stood there for a long time holding that picture. The date scrawled on the back was October 15th, 2004, the morning they vanished. He must have taken it himself. Maybe they'd trusted him enough to let him. Maybe it was before anything went wrong. When we brought the photo back to the families, Nina's knees nearly gave out. Mark caught her before she hit the floor, and for a few seconds nobody said a word. It wasn't the image itself that broke them. It was knowing that the moment captured there, all that youth and ease, had survived longer than the girls ever did. Faye pressed the photo to her chest, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. We promised them the picture would stay with them this time, not in evidence, not behind glass. As more of Darius's belongings were catalogued, a clearer picture formed. He'd stayed near that ravine for months after the cave collapse, scavenging food-setting traps, nursing what he described as a broken leg. The medical examiner said the blood on his knife confirmed the injury cuts and shallow lacerations consistent with self-treatment. His writings mentioned voices in the rain, which Dr. Klein believed pointed to infection fever or guilt-induced delirium. Either way, by winter 2005, he'd vanished into the woods for good. We widened the search radius again, not to find evidence this time, but to find him. The mountain had given back so much, maybe it would yield one more truth. For 2 weeks we combed every drainage line from Ravens Hollow to the Tennessee border. Nothing, just silence, and occasionally the echo of our own voices bouncing off the rock. Then, on the 15th day, while surveying the base of a dry waterfall, Page's boot hit metal. We dug down to uncover a rusted box lid, warped, sealed tight. Inside were scraps of paper so brittle they disintegrated if handled too roughly. Still enough survived to read fragments. They were diary entries later than the letters, later than anything we'd seen before. The last legible date was January 2005. He wrote that he'd tried to dig again after the snow melted, that the ground refused to give them back. Then a line that still sits with me: "If the mountain wants me too, it can have me." Eli stood there for a long while, staring out across the basin. "I think it did," he said quietly. Took him right where he stood. We never found remains, but a few feet from where the box had been buried, there was a small stone mound just high enough to look deliberate. Someone had carved initials into a nearby tree, DH, and beneath them a simple X. It wasn't proof, not in the official sense, but in my bones I knew we'd found where he ended. When word reached town, the families came together again, this time not in grief alone, but in something closer to release. A service was held at the Overlook under Klingman's dome where it all began. Candles flickered along the stone wall, casting their glow over faces lined with time. The three mothers spoke softly. Nina about Tiana's stubborn kindness, Faye about Kim's love for maps, and Mark about Jada's quiet way of seeing beauty in places no one else noticed. It was simple, unadorned, and exactly what they needed. As I stood in the back, the wind carried the faint smell of rain and pine sap. The mountains stretched out under the moonlight, same as they had the night the girls vanished. I remember thinking how something so beautiful could hold such cruelty and still feel holy somehow. When the service ended, people lingered unwilling to leave. I watched the candles burn low, their wax pooling against the cold stone, and thought about the years between that first search and now, the endless waiting, the false hopes, the little signs that led us back piece by piece. It wasn't closure in the clean sense of the word. It was something quieter, more complicated. Dr. Klein later filed her final report. She confirmed that all 3 sets of remains were accounted for and cross-matched through dental records and DNA. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, none of us felt like it truly was. Too many gaps remained: how exactly they'd crossed paths with Holt, why he'd stayed, whether help might have reached them in time if he hadn't been so afraid of the law. The kind of questions that can't be answered by forensics or reports. They just sit there in the silence between facts. I drove home that night through the winding roads, the kind you take slow even when you know every curve. Down in the valleys, fog rolled over the river like breath. I thought about that picture from the ravine, 3 girls frozen in joy a moment that had outlived everything else. And I thought about Holt, a man shaped by the same wildness that killed them, building small altars out of regret, until the mountain finally claimed him too. When I pulled into town, I passed the visitor center where the purple backpack was displayed behind glass. Folks stop there every day, take pictures, read the plaque. To most of them, it's a story with an ending. To me, it's a reminder that endings in places like this are never neat. The wind still moves through Raven's Hollow the same way the creek still whispers over stone, and if you listen long enough, you can almost hear laughter echoing faintly like memory refusing to fade. A month later, heavy rains returned. They hit harder than expected, and one morning a new slide was reported not far from the hollow. Eli and I drove out just to check the damage. The slope was scarred, the creek rerouted again, and in the debris near the edge of the water lay a rusted animal trap, half open, its spring still strong. Tangled in the hinge was a scrap of purple fabric barely an inch wide. We bagged it, sent it for testing. The fibers matched the same nylon from Tiana's pack. It shouldn't have been possible, not after all this time, not after the cave-ins and floods. But there it was, another small reminder that the mountain wasn't done telling its story. Maybe it never would be. As I stood there in the rain, watching the water carve new paths through old ground, I felt that familiar pull of the Smokies, equal parts beauty and warning. The kind that keeps you humble, keeps you coming back. By the time we drove off the ridge, night had settled over the valley and the rain had softened to a mist. The headlights cut narrow tunnels through the fog. I kept thinking about that little scrap of purple, wondering if it was just debris or something more, one last signal from the past, a whisper in the language of storms. Either way, I knew we'd be back out there again soon. The mountain had more to say. It's been years now, but the Smokies still find their way into my dreams. Sometimes it's just a sound, the rush of water in a dark hollow, the distant crack of a branch. Other times it's a color, that deep violet of Tiana's pack, bright against the stone the day we found it. The mind holds on to things the way the forest does, part memory, part myth, all of it alive if you stand still long enough to listen. The rain stopped a week after we found that last scrap of fabric, and the cleanup crews moved in to clear what they could before winter. I went with them one final time. The creek had cut a new path through the basin, reshaping the hollow once again. You'd never know what had happened there unless someone told you. The cave entrance was sealed now. The rocks shifted the air inside, cold and stale. We planted 3 white crosses just above the floodline, simple ones, no marble, no plaques. Nina asked that they stay plain. They've had enough noise, she said. The families came together again that spring, not out of ceremony this time, but because they wanted to. They'd formed something like a bond through those years of waiting, a friendship built out of grief and endurance. Nina started a safety fund for young hikers, small scholarships for outdoor training and backcountry awareness. She named it the Violet Trail. Mark reopened his contracting business after years of leaving it idle, donating part of his profit each season to local search and rescue. And Faye the nurse began teaching wilderness first aid classes every other month in town. None of them spoke of forgiveness, not for Holt, not for the mountain, not even for themselves. What they found instead was something quieter purpose. For me, the aftermath came in pieces. At first it was just exhaustion, the kind that doesn't fade with sleep. I stayed up nights reading old reports, tracing the maps one last time as if some missed turn might still change the ending. But the ending never changed. I finally boxed up my field journals and left them at the ranger station for the archives. Eli retired soon after. He said the forest was starting to talk to him in ways it never used to, and that's when you know it's time to step back. He moved east to Asheville, Bought a small house near his grandkids, and these days he sends postcards every Christmas, always signed the same way. Still listening. The Park Service built a new overlook near the base of Klingman's Dome that summer. It's small, framed in cedar rails with a bronze plaque that reads simply, "In memory of 3 who walked these trails and never truly left them." When the dedication ended, I stood by the edge of the platform looking out over that endless sweep of ridges. The clouds drifted low, curling around the treetops like breath. I remember thinking that the girls would have loved the view. A year later, the case was formally closed, death by accident with contributing factors of exposure and entrapment. That's how it appears in the files. The official wording leaves out the hard parts, the human parts. It doesn't mention the man who stayed too long because he couldn't face his own mistakes, or the parents who spent 4 winters watching the horizon for a sign that never came. It doesn't say that closure doesn't feel like peace, just a kind of acceptance that you've done all you can do. The legend took on its own shape after that. Locals say that if you hike near Raven's Hollow on a still morning, you can hear laughter floating through the trees. 3 voices, young and light. I've walked that trail many times since, and sometimes I think I do hear something a trick of the wind. Maybe, or maybe not. I don't try to explain it anymore. There are things about the wilderness you don't argue with. Over the years, I've watched the story fade into the rhythm of the town. The visitor center displays the purple backpack behind glass, now a quiet centerpiece between old maps and hiking safety brochures. Tourists stop, read the caption, shake their heads, and move on to the next exhibit. They'll never know what it felt like to stand in that cave flashlight, trembling, seeing the truth for the first time. But that's all right. The ones who need to remember already do. When the new generation of rangers came in, I trained them for a season before stepping aside. One of them, a kid named Marcus, asked me once what I'd learned from it all, how you stay steady when you've seen what the mountain can take. I told him the truth, or at least part of it. You don't stay steady. You learn to bend. You carry the noise of it with you, and hope it softens before it breaks you. The land teaches humility if you listen long enough. Every so often, I'll still run into Nina at the grocery store or Mark at the feed supply. They'll ask if I've been out on the trails lately, and I'll nod, knowing they don't mean it literally. What they're really asking is if the mountain's been kind, if the weather's held, if the world's been quiet. And I'll tell them yes, it has, because sometimes mercy is just another word for silence. A few months back, I drove up to the overlook alone early enough that the sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet. I brought fresh wildflowers, set them by the plaque, and sat on the bench until the fog lifted. There's something about that hour when the forest wakes that feels almost forgiving, the way the birds start up one at a time, the way the light turns from gray to gold without anyone noticing. I thought about how those girls must have seen this same dawn once, full of plans and laughter and trust. It broke my heart even now, but it also reminded me why we tell these stories in the first place. Not to dwell on the tragedy, but to keep the truth from slipping away. I don't believe in hauntings, not in the way movies tell it, but I do believe that certain places hold a kind of resonance, a memory that doesn't fade with time. Raven's Hollow is one of those places. It hums beneath your feet if you stand still enough. Some call it eerie. I think it's just the land remembering who passed through. When the wind moves through the firs, it sounds like breathing. I take comfort in that. What happened out there will never make sense in the way we wish it could. A simple hike turned into a decade of grief, all because a few choices met a bad storm at the wrong moment. Yet even in the middle of all that darkness, there was light, people who refused to stop searching, who faced what they found with grace. That more than anything is what stays with me. The Smokies look the same as they did 20 years ago. The ridgelines still roll like waves, the creeks still run cold, and every autumn the leaves turn that same impossible red. But when I walk those trails now, I do it slower. I look up more. I take the kind of care I used to think only mattered for rookies. Maybe that's what the girls left behind, the reminder that beauty and danger live side by side, and it's on us to respect both. When dusk settles over the park and the last visitors head home, I like to stay behind a little longer. The sky goes soft, the air cools, and the world narrows to the sound of water moving over stone. That's when I feel them most, not as ghosts, but as echoes of the lives they should have had. It doesn't hurt as sharply as it used to. It just settles in quiet and constant, like the hum of cicadas after dark. The mountain gave us back what it could. The rest belongs to time now. We've done our part, we searched, we learned, we remembered. The rest is between them and the land that holds them. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever walked through a quiet place and felt a story still hanging in the air, maybe you were hearing theirs. The wind carries it still somewhere beyond the ridge where the light never fully dies.